evening, everyone. My name is Kimberly Beaty. I actually just found out that I was doing this presentation last night. Colin unfortunately could not do the presentation, one of the owners. Just in this past month, I moved up to Burlington from Boston to become the general manager at Shacksbury Cider, which is located down in Shoreham, about 20 minutes west of Middlebury. I'm here tonight to talk to you about Shacksbury's Lost Apple Project. At Shacksbury, we believe cider can and should be daring and complex. Our goal is to create cider that highlights the very diverse characteristics of the apple and show people that apples can create the same expansive array of flavors that grapes can for wine. These apples I'm describing are the apples of America's early cider tradition that have been lost and unmaintained over the years. They are most ideal for cider making, and you can actually still find the trees all over Vermont. You just have to know what you're looking for. So 2 years ago, Colin Davis and David Dulgano, the owners of Shacksbury, launched a Kickstarter to support the Lost Apple Project and set out to find these wild apples. Hundreds of the apples were tasted, tested, and fermented, and of those, 5 varieties were selected to propagate. Last summer, these varieties were grafted to 250 trees, which began the Lost Apple Orchard. Since then, we continue to try to find these wild apples all over. Sometimes it means stopping to taste a lone apple tree on the side of the road or pursuing leads from local residents that have reached out to us about their hidden apple trees on their land. When we taste apples, we're looking for 3 main characteristics. We're looking for sugars, acids, and tannins. The sugars and acids come from the flesh of the fruit, while the tannins are in the skin of the apples. They're what make your mouth go bone dry when you bite into one. Usually we find these apples with 1 or 2 of these characteristics, and on rare occasions we'll find apples with the perfect balance of all 3. The goal is to try to determine if the apples are worth fermenting in a test batch. And when possible, we try to identify the apples using a variety of different references. Otherwise, we'll assign them a tag number. Once we've decided which apples to test, it's time to pick them. This requires ladders, giant tarps, a few good tree climbers, and some really sophisticated PVC pipes with hooks duct taped to the end to shake the trees, which inevitably break at some point during the day, and we always forget to bring a roll of duct tape to fix them. Of course, that's when the tree climbers come in handy. We try to pick the apples right at the point of maximum ripeness. The picking process is pretty simple. We shake the trees, the apples fall on the tarp, and then we collect them into bins. Although the tricky part is definitely trying to avoid the amazingly different types of giant spiders that are always hanging around on the apple trees, which I could definitely do without. Once we have collected the apples, we bring them back to one of our 2 partners that help us with the pressing. Before pressing, we let the apples sweat to ensure maximum ripeness, and then we crush them to help release the juices. The apples are hand-sorted and then hand-sorted before pressed to ensure no rotten apples or other contaminants are making into the juice. This is crucial when you're running a native yeast fermentation. Like I mentioned, we try to balance the acid, tannins, and the sugars in every batch. We also group the batches by geography because, like grapes, apples from a certain location can exhibit flavor profiles specific to the soil in which they're growing, which is their terroir. The juice is pressed into sterile containers of between 5 and 275 gallons, and then it's left to ferment at temperatures between 55 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically, our primary ferments, which start in the fall, will finish around February, and once the primary is done, we'll blend different batches and bottle them with some of the residual sugar remaining. This causes a secondary fermentation in the bottle, which leads to its natural carbonation. The entire process is completed around March or April, and then we let the cider sit for a bit longer to develop the flavors and unify before selling. In order to make this project happen, we have great support from many partners. Pictured here, between Colin on the left and David on the right, is Brad from Windfall Orchards, who presses our smaller scale test batches, and Michael Lee from Twig Farm, who, along with producing some really delicious cheese, helps us each year by harvesting apples from numerous wild apple trees on his own land. Brown's Orchard in Castleton also helps us in pressing our larger scale runs. Once we have produced the single varietal test batches of cider with these wild apples, we determine which apples are best for cider making. We then graft and propagate these varieties as shown, and each of these grafts is tagged, numbered, and dated. In making our cider, we try to avoid sulfating and do not inoculate any cultured yeast. Instead, we use wild yeast that comes in on the apple skin, as well as the yeast that's present on and around the press. For anyone familiar with cheese making, adding sulfites to cider is the equivalent of adding salt or preservatives to cheese, which significantly inhibits its fermentation. Our cider is much wilder than most in process and in fruit origin, which also means it's more variable. But we believe that slow, natural yeast fermentations lend more complexity to the finished cider and make them more expressive in their origin. Pictured here are the owners of Sunrise Orchard, who are actually hosting the Lost Apple Orchard on their land, where we've grafted all the trees that I mentioned. Sunrise Orchard is also where Colin and David first met and where the idea for Shacksbury Cider was born. Of this process, I have to say that tasting the apples is probably my favorite part. We sat down the other day with a box of samples from a woman at Formaggio Kitchen in Boston, which is actually where I worked for the past 2 years. The samples were diligently labeled with titles like "Across the Street Next to Fran's House" or "Right Side of Driveway." What was so fascinating to me was that beyond the 3 main characteristics, many of the apples can display unique hints of flavors that are great for cider, from floral to earthy to spicy, or amazingly, they can almost transform, like one of the apples that I tasted that was, I swear, like biting into a coconut. Now, of course, what does this all lead to? It leads to our Lost Apple series of ciders that this year resulted in our Lost and Found cider. This cider ended up winning a Good Food Award, and last week we had an article published in Food and Wine magazine explaining the Lost Apple Project and highlighting our Lost and Found cider. We will continue to spread the word about the project and introduce people to our ciders with the goal of finding more and more wild apples and introducing them back into the US. Thank you.